For most of the 20th century, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s American-Irish family dominated US politics. Now he is continuing that tradition, following in the footsteps of his father and uncle.
I've come here today to announce my candidacy for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States.
A prominent anti-vaccine activist, he's the fourth member of his family to run for the Democratic nomination for president.
I can run against Trump better than anybody else can.
Do you think you could win?
I know I can win.
We take you inside his campaign, which is a long road, but with an extraordinary long shot prospect at the end of it.
Do you feel in some ways that what you're doing is a continuation of what your father never got to do?
Well, I feel like I'm representing the same kind of values. My worldview is almost completely consistent with my father and uncle's worldview.
He was just 14 years old when his father, Robert F. Kennedy, was shot and killed while celebrating winning the Democratic presidential primary in 1968. 5 years earlier, his uncle, President John F. Kennedy, was assassinated whilst riding in a motorcade through Dallas. I asked him what he would do to address gun violence plaguing communities across America.
First of all, my father and uncle were killed by guns, so I'm sensitive to the suffering that people, and those wounds affected my family for generations. But in this country at this point, for a number of reasons. One, we have a Supreme Court that's given a very expansive view of the Second Amendment, and I believe in the Constitution, even if there's parts of it that I believe are producing, unpleasant results.
Kennedy has positioned himself as an anti-establishment candidate. He says Americans are tired of politicians like Joe Biden and claims the president's foreign policies are being driven by the same ideology that led to the Iraq invasion in 2003.
It was, at that time, the worst foreign policy error in American history. It was a preemptive war against somebody who had done nothing to the United States. There was kind of these vague allegations that maybe he had something to do with 9/11, which he clearly did not. That he may be involved with Al Qaeda, which he was not. That he may have had weapons of mass destruction. And based upon all of these rumors, we invaded the country and we killed 1 million Iraqis, and we left a mess where the country has no cohesion. It's a battle between Shia and Sunni death squads. And we pushed it into turning it essentially into a proxy for Iran, which is exactly the foreign policy objective we had not to do for 40 years previously. Oh, it was a catastrophe and it led ultimately to the wars in Syria and Yemen and Pakistan, Afghanistan. It was a crazy project from the beginning, and they ended up doing just the opposite. And now the same people are back in Washington in the Biden White House, the exact same neocons who, had been ostracized and exiled after the war in Iraq. And they've orchestrated this war in the Ukraine. And, by the way, I support the humanitarian aid to the Ukraine. But Mr. Zelensky and the Ukrainian people are almost as much victims of the neocons in the White House that are today crushing the Ukraine in a proxy war between two great powers to serve these kind of global machinations that they've been up to since 2014. And so we've sacrificed 300,000 Ukrainian soldiers, young people, more than 300,000, who are the flower of Ukrainian youth, to achieve a goal that can't be achieved.
So do you think Russia will win the war in Ukraine?
I think Russians are winning the war. Yes, I believe the Russians will win the war. I think the Russians can't afford to lose that war.
there will be a lot of people who will be surprised to hear that you have that belief that Putin will be victorious.
I mean, look at militarily what's been happening there so far. And I'm very frightened for what's going to happen next, because I think, as soon as the rainy season is over and the wet season, that you're going to see a Russian offensive. And I don't think that the Ukrainian government or the American government are being honest about the costs, about the casualties, and about our role in it. We were told this was a humanitarian mission. And then President Biden said, well, the real mission is to depose Vladimir Putin. And his Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, in April 2022, said that the purpose of the war is to exhaust the Russian forces, to make them incapable of making war anywhere else in the world.
So
That is the opposite of a humanitarian mission. A humanitarian mission means reducing the bloodshed, ending the conflict. What the neocons who are running the White House want is to exhaust the Russian army and depose Vladimir Putin, and that is not going to happen. And listen, I know who Vladimir Putin is. He's a thug and he's a gangster, but that's a different question. Are we actually helping the Ukraine by encouraging and by sacrificing all their young men on the battlefield? I don't think so.
We see no evidence to back up Kennedy's claims of the Biden administration orchestrating the war in Ukraine. The White House blames President Putin for his illegal invasion and sees Russia's aggression as a grave violation of international law. During our time with Kennedy, he shared with us his love of rock and roll music and his frustration battling a rare medical condition which affects his speech.
My voice got turned this way. I got a disease, a neurological injury in 1996 when I was 42 years old. And it's called spasmodic dystonia. And I never knew what happened. The doctors would ask me, did you have a trauma? And then about 3 years ago, I was litigating against the flu vaccine. I was preparing a complaint against all the companies that made flu vaccines, certain kind of flu vaccines. And I had to, for the first time, look at all the list of side effects that are on the manufacturer's inserts. And this disease, spasmodic dystonia, was one of the top injuries.
Some of his own family members have accused him of spreading distrust in the science behind vaccines. And throughout our interview, he doubled down on this, accusing the pharmaceutical industry and social media companies of trying to censor him.
Since announcing your campaign, your brothers, sisters, and wider family have said that they're not supporting you, they're supporting President Biden. How does that feel?
Well, some of them. So I had two of my siblings at my announcement who support me, and I think I have a couple of others who are genuinely supportive. But yeah, there's people in my family who disagree with me on stuff.
How did you come to the point where you decided you wanted to run for president?
Just watching the way the pandemic was conducted, what the countermeasures were conducted, and then the war and the bank bailouts, and I had enough. And I see my country disappearing. And I see the Democratic Party on a path that I don't see they're any different than, it's a uniparty. They're both the party of war. The Democratic Party used to be the party of peace.
When we look at you, you're a lawyer. You're from
a
family who are credible. You are someone who is very sensible.
I have hundreds of cases, including the biggest cases in the last 20 years, that I've argued and, convinced juries of. And I was, well-known, environmentalist and respected. But if you cross that red line of telling the truth about, the capture of our agencies by pharmaceutical companies, that's not permitted. You're not permitted to talk about that in the U.S. media.
How do you feel about potentially running alongside Donald Trump?
I want to run against Trump, and I can run against Trump better than anybody else can.
Do you think you could win?
I know I can win because I can hold it, because I get, I get many of the same supporters. I will take support from President Trump. No other Democrat can do that. My supporters are probably equally Republican and Democrat at this point. And I get more independent voters than anybody. And I can confront President Trump with the lockdowns, which no Democrat can. Lockdowns, he closed 3.3 million businesses. He closed 41% of the black-owned businesses in our country would never reopen again. This is a war on the poor. It was a war on minorities. It was the destruction of the middle class.
Since launching his campaign, the 69-year-old father of 7 has maintained that the CIA, along with the US government, are corrupt, an allegation which they deny.
I know how they work. I know who is corrupt in many of them. I actually know the names, and I know the people, and I know how to unravel it. And this includes, the CIA, which is a captive agency of the military contractors. The job, the function of CIA is to provide a constant pipeline of wars, of new wars all over the world to serve the military contractors and the military industrial complex. And, my father confronted the same problem. My uncle, when, he came in, he said he wanted to take the CIA, shatter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds, because he recognized that its function was no longer U.S. national security, but its own, institutional security, and that its job had devolved into providing wars. And my father had a plan for reorganizing it, and it's essentially the same kind of plan that I would do.
Your family, as we've seen over the decades, have been very close to the royal family, who obviously are a big deal in the UK. Where do you stand on the royals? Are you a fan?
I think they have a hard time. I sympathize with them when I read all the gossip and the meanness that often accompanies it.
Do you think the monarchy will survive?
I have no idea. I assume it will. I think everybody in the world kind of wants the British monarchy to survive. I know there's people who probably think different, but I think it's an institution that the whole world values. That's me with my dad.
On the surface, Kennedy is a man who shoots from the hip and doesn't care for a script. And whilst many may view him as a conspiracy theorist or anti-vaxxer, he says he is determined with his presidential campaign to trigger a political earthquake.